Number 19. The rifle that made firepower personal. You taste grit before you hear the rifle. Heat crushes the shoreline on Bataan. Your thumb shoves 8 rounds into an M1 Garand. The bolt slams forward, and then the weapon does what made it famous. It keeps firing while men around you are still working bolt handles shot by shot. At Quinawan Point, the blast of Garands, machine guns, and pistols was said to be so dense that nothing else could be heard. Here, a gun is judged by one merciless standard. Does it keep you alive for one more minute? Adopted by the U.S. Army in 1936, the semi-automatic M1 changed what a single infantryman could do. But even beneath the praise, the ice was already cracking. And by the bottom, the question would not be how a weapon wins a firefight, but when it became a threat to the future itself. The rifle that turned every squad into a faster clock. On February 16, 1942, Major General Charles Wesson sent a message from the U.S. Army's Ordnance Chief to workers at Winchester. Douglas MacArthur had a verdict from Bataan. The new rifle had stood up to dust, dirt, and a week of combat without cleaning. That was not a sales pitch from a factory floor. It was praise pulled out of a retreat. The man behind the rifle was John C. Garand, a Canadian-born engineer at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. In 1936, after years of trials and arguments over cartridges, clips, and what the Army thought a rifle should be, his design became the standard U.S. service rifle. It weighed about 9.5 pounds, fed from an 8-round N-block clip, and fired .30-06 semi-automatically. Instead of lift, pull, push, lock between every shot, an American rifleman could stay on target and keep pressing the trigger until the clip was empty. In a firefight, that was personal. A squad is not just courage and training, it is timing. How quickly one man can fire, how quickly the next man answers, how little dead space opens between shots. Bolt-action rifles gave you rhythm in chunks. The Garand made that rhythm tighter, faster, meaner. A line of men with M1s did not just send more rounds downrange, it changed the pace the other side had to survive. By December 1941, that idea was no longer living in test reports. Japan attacked the Philippines, and Garands were in foxholes on Bataan. Among the units fighting there were riflemen of the 11th Infantry, some carrying reported loads of 160 rounds each. On paper, that meant 20 full clips per man. In practice, paper was the problem. The Garand's speed depended on a specific piece of stamped metal, not a detachable box magazine. Not loose rounds in the pocket, an 8-round clip that dropped into the rifle's internal magazine as a unit. Fire the 8th shot, the empty clip ejected with the famous metallic ping, and the rifle was ready for another full load. Clean, fast, efficient. The system worked because the ammunition was supposed to arrive in the right format, but on Bataan, it often did not. Ammunition existed, .30 caliber was there, but much of it came on 5-round Springfield clips meant for the older bolt-action M1903. Men using America's most advanced service rifle had to strip cartridges off the wrong clips and reload them by hand into Garand clips under combat conditions. Dust in your mouth, sweat in your eyes, incoming fire. The bottleneck was not the rifle, but the small metal device that let it be itself. That mismatch explains something important about weapons near the top of this iceberg. The deadliest part is not always the mechanism. Sometimes it is the supply chain trailing behind it. Springfield Armory would eventually produce M1s on a scale that matched the rifle's ambition. 3 shifts, about 1,300 rifles per shift at peak wartime output. Roughly 164 rifles an hour, more than 3.1 million by the end of the war from Springfield alone. But in the Philippines in early 1942, the future had arrived before the packaging caught up. And still, the rifle earned its reputation there. At Quinawan Point, where American and Filipino forces fought in brutal close combat, reported fire from Garands, machine guns, and pistols became so heavy that nothing else could be heard. That is what semi-automatic firepower looked like when it reached ordinary infantrymen. Not an experimental wonder, not a specialist weapon, but a service rifle, making individual soldiers faster than the men facing them. Which brings us back to that ping. For decades, one story followed the M1 everywhere. Japanese soldiers listened for the empty clip to ring out, recognized an American rifle was dry, and rushed the man before he could reload. It is a perfect war story because it sounds exactly right. One tiny engineering signature, one fatal second. Evidence for that as a routine battlefield killer is thin to absent. The sound was real. The myth is real. The proof is not. On battlefields loud enough for Quinawan Point to disappear into its own gunfire, the Garand's more immediate weakness was usually simpler and uglier. Not that the enemy heard an empty rifle, but that the ammunition kept arriving on the wrong clips. On April 9, 1942, Bataan fell anyway. Number 18. Hitler's buzzsaw. The sound made open ground feel impossible. In 1941, German gunners were still arguing over what the next machine gun should be called. The weapon that came out of those trials entered service in 1942 as the MG-42, a cheaper and faster-produced successor to the MG-34. It changed what battlefield noise could do. It turned distance into fear. Its cyclic rate was roughly 1,200 rounds per minute. The exact figure shifts depending on the source. The effect does not. One burst, and the air itself seemed to tear. In the early 1930s, the German army wanted a true general-purpose machine gun. It had to be lighter, simpler, and easier to mass-produce. It also had to work on a bipod, a tripod, or an anti-aircraft mount. Johannes Grossfuss, a stamping specialist with no firearms background, won the design competition. That mattered. The gun's menace came as much from manufacturing as from mechanics. Stamped and welded parts, roller locking. A shape built for volume, not for careful work at a craftsman's bench. By 1941, the Army was running 1,500 guns through combat trials before formal adoption. In the field, the reputation spread faster than the explanation. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, American troops were already hearing about it from men who had faced it. They talked about the speed. They talked about the barrel changes. They talked about the sound, a ripping metallic vibration that made crossing open ground feel less like movement and more like a gamble you might not survive. The nickname came easily, Hitler's buzzsaw, not because the gun sawed wood, because it sounded like it was cutting men out of the landscape. The weapon firing that fast had a problem built into it. Why didn't it cook itself alive? Why didn't the barrel become a useless iron rod after a few seconds of sustained fire? The answer sat inside the gun's routine. It had a quick-change barrel system. The drill was not optional. It kept the weapon alive. By autumn 1944, German units were fielding one MG-42 per 10-man squad. More than 400,000 were produced before Germany's surrender. The war settled into the rhythm of a gun that could empty belts at shocking speed, but only if someone was ready to break the barrel lock, pull the hot tube free, and fit a fresh one before the metal gave up. The gun was not unstoppable because it was immortal. It worked because crews stopped it on purpose. The manuals put the limit in plain terms. Change the barrel after 250 rounds of full auto fire. Emergency limit, 400. Not glory, just a maintenance schedule written in heat. So when the weapon roared and then went silent for those few seconds, the pause belonged to the design. The silence was not relief. It was the machine catching its breath before it started screaming again. A 1944 Gustloff-Werke example in the Imperial War Museums measures 1,220 millimeters long, 370 millimeters high, and weighs 11.85 kilograms. Heavy. Fast. In the hands of a German squad, it could anchor a line the way artillery anchored a front. The MG-34 stayed in service too. The MG-42 did not need to replace it completely to become the standard answer at the front. Once men on the ground learned what that sound meant, cover stopped feeling like protection. It felt like a prayer. And when the barrel change came late, The prayer ended under that same tearing sound. Number 17. The tank that shocked the invaders. On June 22, 1941, the sky over the Soviet border filled with German aircraft. Operation Barbarossa began with confidence so broad it barely resembled caution. But on the roads and in the mud, German crews ran into a machine that did not match the briefings. The T-34 was still young, only just entering service in 1940. Its sloped armor turned shots aside and made familiar anti-tank weapons feel suddenly too light. German reports kept coming back to the same problem. Rounds that should have killed the tank were failing to bite. The machine did not look graceful. It looked unfinished, blunt, almost improvised. In combat, it forced crews to stop and recalculate under fire. At first, the shock was not about numbers. It was about angle, weight, and survival. The T-34 combined sloped armor, a diesel engine, wide tracks, and a 76.2mm gun. Its design spread shock across the hull instead of taking it straight on. The armor thickness varied, but even the exposed figures tell the story. 15 to 45 millimeters of steel, shaped so every millimeter worked harder. German gunners saw the result in real time. Von Kleist later called it the finest tank in the world. This was not distant admiration. It was a line from the field, carrying dread. When a tank starts shrugging off fire, crews stop thinking only about destruction. They start looking for any way to solve the problem in front of them. In August 1941, Hitler ordered Guderian's second tank group toward Kharkov. He wanted to hit the factory making T-34s before the design could spread. The order shows how much alarm the tank had created. It was no longer just a vehicle on the battlefield. It was becoming an industrial event. By then, numbers mattered too. This flawed machine was making an invasion feel underarmed. Soviet plants were rushing out a model that Western and Russian naming conventions do not even fully agree on, because the story was never a clean model year. It was a moving target. It changed by month, by factory, by the mark stamped into the armor. Some early examples carried the index A-34. Some preserved tracks were cast on June 21, 1941, literally one day before Barbarossa. The war was already inside the machine before most crews had even learned how to use it. But the legend had weak seams. Early T-34s were brutal to operate. Visibility was poor, the ergonomics were cramped, the transmission could fail. Production quality varied so much that two tanks from different plants could feel like cousins rather than twins. That mattered, because a tank is only as strong as the men inside it. Inside the T-34, those men were fighting the machine as much as the enemy. The engine offered 500 horsepower. Power did not fix bad sightlines or a sticky gearbox. It only made the ride louder. Then came December 6, 1941. Soviet troops counterattacked from the ground now occupied by the T-34 History Museum at the opening of the Battle for Moscow. By then, the tank had already become a symbol, but symbols hide a lot. The Soviet side would later point to totals like 35,467, or 35,530, or even 54,000 tanks released by the USSR's 7 major plants, depending on which archive and definition you follow. That confusion belongs to the story. What counts as a model 1941 when factories, markings, and battlefield versions keep shifting under fire? The answer had been sitting in the hull all along. The T-34 was feared for its strength. It was feared because it arrived before Germany had fully learned how to name the thing that was hurting it. The finest tank in the world. Even the compliment sounded like bad news. Number 16. Stalin's organ. On June 21, 1941, the Soviet Union rushed a new rocket launcher and its M13 rocket into serial production. There was no parade for it, no polished unveiling, just a decree, a deadline, and a machine being pushed toward war while the German invasion was already on the move. By July 2nd, Captain Ivan Flerov's battery had left Moscow in secrecy. It was a tiny experimental unit with only 7 launchers and barely enough training to understand what it could do. The artillery strike that arrived like weather was already being assembled. On July 14, 1941, at 15:15, Flerov's battery opened fire near Orsha in occupied Belarus. 7 launchers sent 112 rockets into the rail junction and the bridge over the Orshitsa in one violent burst. The rockets were M13S, 132 millimeters across, 1.41 meters long, each carrying a 22-kilogram warhead out to a stated range of 8.5 kilometers. But the numbers only explain the mechanism. They do not explain the sound. German soldiers later called it Stalin's organ because the launch came with a long, rising howl before impact. Not a gunshot, not a shell whistle, but something that seemed to drag the air itself toward the target. That mattered because the Katyusha was built for a different kind of fear. A normal gun tries to hit one point. This weapon sprayed an area, then was gone almost as fast as it appeared. Mounted on trucks, it could fire and relocate before the enemy properly answered. The whole design was speed, shock, and escape. Not accuracy. Collapse. In the first summer of the invasion, collapse was a weapon all by itself. The deeper story was how fragile the secret was behind it. The battery had been thrown together in 3 or 4 days. Training was minimal. In July and August, 214 factories were pulled into rocket weapon production as Soviet industries scrambled to scale the system before the front could swallow it. That rush is what made the launcher powerful, but it also made it vulnerable. If one experimental battery could be captured intact, the entire mystery could leak. So Flerov's unit kept moving. It fought through the autumn, carrying a weapon that was already becoming legend, while the legend was still unfinished. Then came October 1941, near Bogatyr, with capture closing in and the front breaking around them. The crew understood the choice in front of them. Keep the launchers, and the Germans might study every rail, every mount, every clue. Destroy them, and the secret dies with the machine. So they did. The launchers were blown up by their own crew. The weapon that had sounded like a storm was reduced to wreckage by the men who had carried it. The threat was not losing it in battle. It was someone else learning how to make it. Number 15. The bomb that skipped. The bomb had to miss the water correctly. On January 23, 1943, over the coast at Chesil in Dorset, Barnes Wallis watched his miracle weapon fail again. Metal test spheres dropped from a Wellington smashed themselves apart on impact. The idea was elegant. A 9,250-pound mine skipping across water, passing over torpedo nets, striking a dam wall, then sinking into place before detonating with more than 6,000 pounds of Torpex. But waves changed everything. Impact changed everything. The sea broke the weapon open. Then a wooden test sphere bounced 13 times. For the first time, the impossible looked teachable. Even that success had a catch. Between April 21st and May 1st at Reculver in Kent, the design failed again. The outer spherical casing shattered. The metal cylinder inside kept traveling. The failure gave them the answer. Upkeep stopped being a sphere and became a cylinder, because the sea had already made the choice. One problem was gone. Another made Operation Chastise sound almost absurd. The bomb could not just be dropped at a target. It had to be released at about 60 feet over the water, at roughly 232 miles per hour, at night, from a heavy Lancaster carrying the weapon externally. Too high, and the mine would break or skip wrong. Too low, and the aircraft might hit the water. Too slow, and it would sink short. Too fast, and it would overshoot. The whole attack depended on hitting a miss with exact precision. By late March 1943, Wing Commander Guy Gibson was assembling No. 617 Squadron at RAF Scampton for that job. 19 Lancasters, 133 aircrew. This was not a broad raid. It was a narrow one. Each bomber had one task, and nothing about it could be improvised in the moment. The weapon was not judged by force alone. It was judged by whether men in darkness could place a spinning cylinder into a few dozen feet of vertical and horizontal space while flak climbed toward them. Beyond the dam was not a bunker or a gun pit. It was a river valley with homes, roads, workshops, and sleeping civilians. When the Mona and Ada dams were chosen, the target changed shape. It was no longer a military position in the ordinary sense. It was infrastructure. Water held behind concrete. Water pointed at everything downstream. A soldier can hide from shrapnel. A town cannot hide from its own river. On the night of May 16, 1943, the squadron took off from Scampton. You are in a Lancaster now, 60 feet above black water, and even that number feels generous. The altimeter is not enough. Darkness flattens distance. The dam ahead is more sensed than seen. Searchlights and tracers claw upward. The aircraft is heavy. The approach is straight. There is almost no room to be wrong. Gibson attacked the Mona first at 12:28 a.m. It did not collapse on the first drop, or the second, or the third. 5 attacks were needed before the breach came. Then the Ada was hit, and at 1:52 a.m., that dam failed too. Downstream in Wicked, Clemens Moles saw the blast column, and then he saw the flood. The engineering triumph arrived as a wall of water. Nearly 1,300 people were killed on the ground. Among them were civilians and forced laborers housed in camps and barracks near the reservoirs and industrial sites below. 53 of the 133 RAF aircrew were killed, and 3 were captured. The cleanest version of the story does not stay clean for long. The weapon was built to strike masonry. Its path ran through workers' housing, factory districts, bridges, roads, and families asleep in the dark. The paradox comes back in the details. A crew had to hold 60 feet and 232 miles per hour in darkness, under fire, with enough precision to turn a lake into a weapon. They did it with something almost embarrassingly simple. 2 spotlights were mounted under the aircraft, angled so their beams converged only when the Lancaster was at the correct height over the water. For distance, there was a small wooden sight lined up with the dam towers. When the lights met and the towers matched the marks, the bomb went. The crews flew at 60 feet, about 232 miles per hour, at night, using crossed beams and a handheld sight to release a spinning 9,250-pound mine into a dam. 53 airmen never came back. Nearly 1,300 people on the ground died anyway. Number 14. The cannon too big to be useful. 7,100 kilograms. That was the armor-piercing shell, nearly 8 tons of steel for a single shot, carrying 250 kilograms of explosive and traveling about 38 kilometers. The high-explosive round was lighter, if that word still means anything here, at 4,800 kilograms, with 700 kilograms of explosive and a range closer to 47 kilometers. The bore was 800 millimeters across, 80 centimeters, about 31 inches. It was less a shell than a section of machinery thrown through the air. In spring 1942, Erich von Manstein's 11th Army was preparing to finish Sevastopol. The Soviet fortress port had already absorbed months of attack. Concrete batteries were still firing. Caves and underground positions were still holding. On June 2, 1942, the German bombardment opened with nearly 900 guns and airstrikes. Somewhere inside that mass of steel sat the strangest artillery piece of the war, Krupp's 80-centimeter railway gun, officially Schwere Gustav, called Dora by the unit that served it. Start with the gun itself. About 1,350 tons assembled, 47.3 meters long, 11.6 meters high, 7.1 meters wide. The barrel alone stretched 32.48 meters. A normal artillery piece traverses on its mount. This one did not, at least not in the usual sense. To aim left or right, it had to move along a curved section of railway track. Even pointing it took rail work. North of Sevastopol, the gun position looked more like a work site than a battery. Rail spurs had to be laid before the weapon could exist in one place. Twin tracks had to curve so the barrel could find its target. Sections arrived separately by rail because there was no other sensible way to move something this large. Cranes lifted them into place. Guards ringed the area. What reached Crimea was not a cannon ready to fire. It was parts, labor, track, timing. By the middle of deployment, Men were still assembling the thing. Cranes hung over the rails. Workers stood on the track bed and around the mounting points. The siege weapon was becoming a construction project in real time. The famous image is simple: the biggest gun of the war smashing the strongest fortress in the Crimea. But Sevastopol was not reduced by giant shells alone, because giant shells were almost the one thing this weapon did not have many of. The ammunition supply commonly given for Sevastopol is 48 rounds. Some sources say 47 fired. Either way, the number is small enough to change the picture. Nearly 900 guns opened the siege. Tens of thousands of ordinary shells did the routine work of grinding defenses down. Dora delivered spectacle, a handful of extreme blows inside a much larger industrial bombardment. It did hit real targets. In early June, the giant gun fired on the northern forts and around Severnaya Bay. Its most famous shot was credited with wrecking an ammunition dump buried under rock near the bay, one of the few results dramatic enough to fit the mythology built around the weapon. But spectacle and utility were already pulling apart from the first rounds. Every firing consumed ammunition that was difficult to replace. Every shot ate at the barrel. Every adjustment depended on rails, crews, and a prepared position that could not simply be shifted on a whim. The level that matters to a soldier, the question is simpler. Does the weapon help men survive and win here, now? Gustav answered in a strange way. It could destroy what smaller guns could not easily crack. But first the army had to build a firing world around it. By the time Sevastopol fell in early July 1942, the fortress had finally given way. The supergun had reached the end of its brief usefulness there. Its barrel was worn. Its special ammunition was nearly exhausted. The myth had grown larger than the military return. A weapon designed to dominate the battlefield had spent part of its life waiting for track, cranes, and alignment. After the firing stopped, what remained north of Sevastopol did not look like triumph. Curved rails in the dust, a used barrel, an artillery giant that needed its own piece of railroad before it could fire once. Number 13. The engine you heard before death. At 4:18 a.m. on June 13, 1944, the sky over Kent changed with a sound people did not understand yet. A German V-1 flying bomb came down at Swanscombe, still hidden inside the language of war, still too new to have a name in the minds of the people who heard it. Then London got its first direct hit at Grove Road, Mile End, under a railway bridge near Antill Road, Burnside Street, and Belraven Street. 6 people were killed there. 42 were injured. The bomb announced itself, then vanished. It was not a bomber overhead. It was not a shell. It was a machine with a pulse jet engine, a crude autopilot, and a preset course that had already decided where it would die before it ever crossed the channel. Once launched, no pilot or radio operator was guiding it. Gyros, servos, a compass, and a little nose propeller carried it toward the city. That is what made it feel wrong. It arrived as sound first. A harsh, buzzing engine. Londoners would learn to recognize in seconds. The first strike at Grove Road tore into homes and smashed the Liverpool Street Stratford railway line. One local remembered everyone being sworn to secrecy. But secrets do not survive explosions for long. By the time the dust settled, word had already spread through the neighborhood. The railway was back in service within 40 hours, propped on a temporary bridge, as if the city were trying to patch a wound before anyone else could see it. The weapon had already done its work. It had shown that a new kind of attack could cut into daily life itself. Then came the pattern. The engine buzzing. The engine cutting out. A few seconds of silence. Silence changed fear. As long as the pulse jet was still screaming overhead, there was still motion, still distance, still the thin hope that it might pass. When the sound stopped, the bomb had entered its final dive. There was no steering now, no correction, no warning left to spend. For civilians below, silence did not mean relief. It meant the weapon was already dropping toward the ground. By June 27th, a V-1 hit Highbury Corner at lunchtime, when the city was moving, shopping, working, pretending it could keep its rhythm. The blast killed 28 people and injured about 150. The bomb itself was about 25 feet long, a flying machine that could reach up to 400 miles per hour, but the number that mattered was not its speed. It was the fact that it could arrive above a crowded neighborhood and turn an ordinary pause in the engine into a countdown. London was heavily targeted after the Normandy landings disrupted German launch sites in northern France, and more than 20,000 V-1s would eventually be fired at British and continental targets. In the London area alone, the campaign would leave 6,184 dead and 17,981 seriously injured. The first weeks were enough to reveal the weapon's shape. Not a battlefield tool, not a rifle for soldiers in a field. A terror machine aimed at commuter lines, lunch crowds, terraced streets, and the moment when everyone heard the engine go quiet. Every buzzing second overhead became the sound of a death already in motion. Number 12. The weapon faster than warning. The rocket that arrived before the sound. On September 8, 1944, on the streets of Chiswick in West London, people heard the blast before they understood what had happened. That is the strange fact at the center of the V2, not the speed itself, the order of events. The missile was already there, and only then did the sound catch up. At 6:43 p.m., it struck Staveley Road, killing 3 people, 3-year-old Rosemary Ann Clark at number 1, Ada Harrison at number 3, and a serviceman passing through the street, named in local accounts as Browning. By then, Germany had been calling it a vengeance weapon, but the word was propaganda. In practice, it was terror artillery with a rocket engine, a warhead of about a ton, and a range of roughly 200 miles. It could be fueled with liquid oxygen and a 75% alcohol-water mixture. It could be launched from a mobile Milowagen and sent across the sky with no pilot, no return, and no chance for anyone below to do anything but wait. Or not even wait. In Chiswick, they did not get that luxury. The paradox was simple and cruel. The V2 arrived faster than warning could travel. No siren could meaningfully save the target. The explosion came first. The sound came after. By then, the street was already torn open. It felt less like an aircraft attack and more like a crime committed by physics itself. But the weapons story was not beginning over London. It was running backward, into the machines and bodies that made this possible. The V2 first succeeded in test form on October 3, 1942. After that, the program scaled into a monstrous production line. Around 10,000 rockets were built, but only about 3,000 were ever launched offensively. The rest vanished into training, transport, technical failure, and the brutal arithmetic of trying to mass-produce something so unstable that it could kill its own crew, burn through its fuel, or break apart before it ever reached the target. That is where the clean image of a superweapon starts to crack. The V2 was not just a technological leap, it was also a labor system. Peenemünde gave it its engineers, with Werner von Braun among them. Middelburg and the Dora Mittelbau camp system gave it prisoners. Concentration camp laborers assembled the missile underground under lethal conditions, and thousands died making V-weapons before a single one hit an Allied city. The numbers are hard to separate, but the moral equation is not. More people died building the V2 than were killed by its explosions on the other side. At Nordhausen, the factory was hidden below ground for a reason. The rocket was supposed to look modern, mobile, unstoppable. What it actually required was a tunnel, forced labor, liquid oxygen, rail transport, and a war economy willing to spend human lives to launch something that still missed often enough to be called accurate only by desperation. Its fins were clipped so it could fit through standard European railway tunnels. Even the shape of the machine was shaped by logistics. So when the first V2 hit England, it was not just a new weapon entering combat. It was the moment a secret project became a public method of killing. The machine crossed 200 miles of sky in silence, arrived before the warning, and left behind a crater, a street address, and 3 names on a casualty list. The official story called it a vengeance weapon. The real one was already written into the basement factories and the bodies beneath them. Number 11. The bomb that chose a ship. On September 8, 1943, Italy announced the armistice, and Admiral Carlo Bergamini's fleet was still at La Spezia, suspended between one war and the next. By dawn on September 9th, the battleship Roma was underway, not toward the Allied landings at Salerno, but first toward La Maddalena. Then came word that the Germans had occupied it, and the ship turned toward Allied-controlled Bona. Roma was trying to survive the end of an alliance. That mattered because the danger was no longer just the enemy ahead. It was the friend who still knew exactly where to look. Roma was a 45,000-ton battleship carrying the weight of a navy's pride. In the afternoon off northern Sardinia, near the Gulf of Asinara, that weight became the target. High above her, around 5,000 meters up, came Dornier Do-217 bombers from KG-100. They carried a new kind of weapon, the Fritz X, a radio-guided armor-piercing bomb weighing 3,450 pounds. It was built to punch through deck and belt armor that ordinary bombs could not touch. The attack force was large enough to feel like a formation for a parade and not a killing field. 28 Do-217s in all, but the bomb that mattered did not fall like a bomb. It steered. It waited. A human hand held its path. Agostino Incisa della Rocchetta was on Roma's bridge when he first saw one descending. At a glance, it looked like a recognition flare from a German aircraft. Not an attack, a signal. But it did not break into stars. It came straight down with a bluish trail, quiet enough to be mistaken for something harmless, until it was too late. The falling bomb that still had a pilot was already lining up on the ship below. First Fritz X struck about 1542 near the central starboard side between anti-aircraft mounts 9 and 11. It punched through the armor and exploded below the keel, slowing Roma and ripping the body of the ship from underneath. Minutes later, another guided bomb came in near the forward engine room area. That one lit the magazine spaces. Incisa was burned on the bridge, but he later gave the abandoned ship order as the battleship began to roll. The official numbers are messy, but the sequence is not. The first hit crippled her, the second doomed her, and the sea finished the rest. By the time the smoke cleared, 622 men had been pulled out alive at first, and 596 were the final survivors after more deaths aboard rescue ships and in hospital. The rest went with the ship, or with what the ship became as it broke in two and slipped under. This was not a random bomb strike. It was a weapon designed to defeat armor by choosing the exact point where armor ended and catastrophe began. Fritz X was a German radio-guided armor-piercing glide bomb, and on September 9, 1943, it was used against the Italian battleship Roma after Italy's armistice. The shock was not only that a battleship could be sunk, it was that the attackers were former allies, flying under the same sky, using the same familiarity to turn surrender into a firing solution. Roma sank with heavy loss of life after being hit by guided bombs. In that moment, the war at sea stopped being only about shells, torpedoes, and tonnage. It became about a weapon that could choose its ship. Number 10. The secret inside the shell. In the paperwork, it was just VT. In August 1942, aboard USS Cleveland in Chesapeake Bay, sailors loaded 5-inch/38 rounds and fired at radio-controlled drones. The shells burst close. The drones broke apart. The reports stayed classified, but the effect did not. The shell that did not need to hit you. Why did Allied anti-aircraft fire suddenly become so much deadlier against aircraft that had once slipped through a sky full of bursting shells? The myth is simple. Better gunners, more experience, more guns firing faster. But the record changes too sharply for that, and the evidence sits in dates, contracts, and kill reports. In August 1940, Vannevar Bush's National Defense Research Committee gave Merle A. Tuve of the Carnegie Institution a problem gunners had been living with for decades. An anti-aircraft shell had three honest outcomes. It hit, it missed, or it exploded by timer guesswork. That was acceptable on paper, but terrible against a dive bomber crossing the sky in seconds. At this height of the iceberg, weapons were still being judged by a brutal standard. Did they keep the men on deck alive through the next attack? Tuve's crash program became Section T. By spring 1942, the work moved to Silver Spring, Maryland, into the new Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. The name attached to the secret was camouflage. VT suggested variable time, as if this were merely a better clock and a shell nose. But clocks do not get guarded like state jewels. This became one of the most closely protected Allied technologies of the war. The paper trail starts to thicken after the Chesapeake Bay tests. Cleveland trials worked in August 1942, so Washington authorized the first production contracts, $85 million. Soon, 5,000 rounds were heading to the Pacific Fleet through Mare Island. A strange laboratory idea had turned into factory output, shipping orders, and ammunition lockers. Somebody high up believed this thing would change combat. Then the combat report arrived. On January 5, 1943, near Guadalcanal, USS Helena fired from her aft 5-inch battery and shot down a Japanese dive bomber. That is not myth. That is a date, a ship, a battery, and an aircraft falling out of the sky. After that, the trail spreads outward. Over Britain, these rounds helped bring down V-1 flying bombs. Some later summaries lazily throw V-2 attacks into the same sentence, but that gives the weapon credit beyond physics. A V-2 was not the sort of target wartime anti-aircraft fire could realistically reach. The record is strong enough without the exaggeration. In the Pacific, the same secret made defenses against kamikaze attacks far deadlier. In the Ardennes, it would be turned on ground targets, bursting above troops instead of beside them. So the myth starts to fail. This was not only better aiming, the shell itself was doing something. Inside the nose was a miniature radio transmitter receiver, built small enough to fit into a spinning shell and tough enough to survive launch. As the projectile flew, it sent out a signal. When that signal reflected off an aircraft and came back strong enough, the fuse triggered the burst. That was the deception hidden inside the name. It was never really about time. It was about proximity. The shell did not need a direct hit. It only needed to know it was close. But even that secret would have meant little on its own. Radar had to find the target. Fire control computers had to predict where sky and shell would meet. Factories had to build components precise enough to survive gunfire. Inspectors had to catch the ones that would fail in the barrel. By the end of the war, about 22 million VT fuses had been produced, and the unit cost had collapsed from $732 in 1942 to $18 in 1945. The miracle was tiny, but the system behind it was enormous. Allied shells became deadlier because they learned to burst at the moment when near was enough. By the Battle of the Bulge, that same logic was opening artillery rounds over roads, tree lines, and frozen fields, turning winter air into the killing zone. The secret inside the shell was not more explosive filler or a smarter stopwatch. It was a radio whisper, sent out in flight and answered by whatever was unlucky enough to be nearby. Somewhere above the snow, before anyone on the ground ever saw the shell itself, that whisper came back from the dark, and the air opened. Number 9. The submarine that arrived too late. A submarine from the future entered a war that was already dying. On the evening of April 30, 1945, while Berlin was collapsing above ground, U-2511 slipped out of Bergen under Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee and headed for the Atlantic. She carried 57 men, 6 bow torpedo tubes, and 20 torpedoes in a hull built around batteries, streamlining, and underwater speed. This was not the old U-boat model, a surface raider that dived when aircraft appeared. It was the opposite, a boat meant to live below the surface and fight there. If a submarine like this had arrived 2 years earlier, the Atlantic might have become a very different war. By 1943, Germany was already losing the contest this boat had been built to answer. Allied radar was finding submarines on the surface. Aircraft were closing the mid-Atlantic gap. Escorts were improving. Survival came down to timing. The Type 21 was built for exactly that fight. Stay submerged, move fast underwater, fire from below, reload, and escape without exposing yourself to the sky. The numbers show why it alarmed post-war analysts. About 17 to 18 knots submerged by design. Faster underwater than earlier U-boats could ever hope to sustain. a larger battery capacity, a cleaner hull. No stern tubes because the shape had been optimized for underwater performance, not for inherited habits. The torpedo room showed the same logic. All reserve torpedoes were concentrated forward. Stowage existed for 23, but in practice, 20 were carried because 3 positions had to remain free for servicing. The weapon itself was not larger. The method was sharper. Get in unseen, fire quickly, leave underwater before the hunt could close around you. On May 1st, Schnee encountered enemy forces and avoided them while submerged. That matters because the claim attached to U-511 was not just that it looked advanced in specifications. It was that it had done, under wartime conditions, what the whole design promised. A few days later, on May 4th, Karl Donitz's ceasefire order reached the boat. The war was effectively over. Yet only hours after receiving it, U-511 tracked a British force by passive sonar. In Schnee's later account, the boat crept to roughly 500 meters from the cruiser HMS Norfolk without the escorts detecting her. 500 meters. Close enough for a kill. He did not fire. If that account is true, the most modern German submarine of the war reached a perfect attack position only after it no longer had permission to attack. As a demonstration, it was almost cruel in its timing. Engines humming. Torpedoes ready. The war already ending. A boat this advanced did not fail because Germany lacked ambition. 118 Type 21s were commissioned. It did not fail because naval officers missed the point. They understood it. The Atlantic War had become a contest of detection, endurance, and seconds of exposure. And this design answered all 3. The failure happened in less dramatic places: factory floors, assembly halls, rushed drawings, and mismatched sections. Germany tried to mass-produce the Type 21 under bombing pressure by building sections in different factories and assembling them later. It sounded efficient. It produced chaos. Components arrived with defects. Sections did not always fit cleanly. Workmanship varied. Systems that looked revolutionary on paper emerged compromised in metal. The post-war U.S. Navy report admired the concept and called it a radical departure, but it also found unfinished design decisions, construction deviations, hydraulic problems, and performance that did not always match the promise. Even the celebrated 18-knot underwater figure blurred when tested against real boats. The Type 21 was advanced, but it was not magic. Timing finished the job. By the time a very small number were actually operational, Germany was already losing ports, fuel, crews, training time, and control of the air. A submarine designed to reshape the Atlantic entered service after the Atlantic campaign it was meant to save had already been decided. U-511 sailed on its first patrol on April 30, 1945. It returned to Bergen on May 5th. Its combat record lasted 5 days. So the story ends in the most ordinary way. The submarine that looked like the future failed because production was disordered, readiness was incomplete, and the calendar had run out. Officially, the Type 21 was commissioned 118 times. In the war that mattered, it arrived once. Number 8. The submarine with bombers inside. On July 26, 1945, 2 Japanese submarines cleared harbor with sealed orders and cargo locked inside a steel cylinder on the deck. I-400 and I-401 headed east into the Pacific for a strike meant to come from nowhere. Not from a carrier task force, not from a captured island airfield. From a submarine that would surface at night, open a watertight hangar, and produce bombers. The paperwork is almost cold. Target: Ulithi Atoll. Launch date: August 17, 1945. Objective: attack the U.S. fleet anchorage where American carriers were massing for operations against Japan. The machine assigned to that mission was almost as startling as the target. At 400 feet 3 inches long and 5,223 tons on the surface, the I-400 class was among the largest submarines of the entire war, longer than a football field. Built for a range of 37,500 nautical miles at 14 knots. It carried 8 forward 21-inch torpedo tubes and 20 torpedoes like a conventional attack boat. It also carried its own air arm. The design breaks the normal idea of a submarine. The Imperial Japanese Navy completed 3 of them: I-400, I-401, and I-402. Each was built around a sealed hangar 11.5 feet in diameter, a tube running forward of the conning tower like an impossible second hull. Inside were 3 Aichi M6A1 Siran attack aircraft, not full-size on display, not lashed to the deck, hidden. Earlier plans had aimed even farther. The Panama Canal had been studied as a target. So had attacks on the American West Coast with biological weapons in some of the darkest proposals of the war. By the summer of 1945, Japan was no longer choosing among grand strategic options. It was looking for one last blow that might still land. Somewhere in that shift, weapons stopped being tools for one battle and become systems built to cross oceans and hit places that were supposed to be safe behind the front. This was an aircraft carrier that hid underwater. You can feel the contradiction in the hull itself. A submarine wants to be small, clean, hard to detect. A carrier wants space, deck operations, aircraft handling, fuel, ordnance, timing. The I-400 tried to be both at once. It displaced 6,560 tons submerged. It carried bombs and aerial torpedoes for the aircraft, as well as torpedoes for itself. Per submarine, the aviation load could include 4 aerial torpedoes, or 3 bombs weighing 1,760 pounds each, or 12 550-pound bombs. It was a strike package folded into a submersible body. That makes the sealed hangar even stranger, because the obvious problem never goes away. 3 aircraft do not fit inside a tube that narrow unless the aircraft themselves are designed around the tube. The Siran was built to disappear into storage. Its wings folded, its tail folded. Components were arranged so the aircraft could be packed into that cylindrical hangar and brought out only when the boat surfaced. Once night fell, crewmen could roll the planes out, unfold them, arm them, place them on the forward catapult, and launch all 3 in under 15 minutes if they flew without floats. That was the plan. A submarine crosses the Pacific unseen, rises in darkness, and 3 attack aircraft suddenly appear where no runway and no carrier had been seen hours before. Then came the part the design never solved in war. Launching was only half of it. Recovery was the bill that came due afterward. If the Siran carried floats, the aircraft could, in theory, ditch nearby and be hoisted back aboard. That required time, calm water, and a submarine lingering on the surface after giving away its position. If they launched without floats for speed, the mission became one way. By mid-1945, against Ulithi, that was exactly what the plan had become: a suicide air raid. So when I-400 and I-401 left Japan, they were not carrying a reusable air group in any practical sense. They were carrying 3 men per boat inside a delivery system that blurred the line between submarine, carrier, and guided sacrifice. The strike never came. Japan accepted surrender before August 17th. The submarines surfaced, dumped their weapons overboard, and surrendered to U.S. forces instead. The Americans examined them closely. Then, in 1946, they sank them before the Soviets could inspect the technology for themselves. So the operational history ends almost blankly. No bombs over Ulithi, no shattered locks at Panama, no combat launch at all. What remains is the image: a submarine surfacing in the dark, deck crew moving around a sealed cylinder, the hangar door opening, and 3 folded aircraft beginning to emerge. Number 7. The Iceberg made into a weapon. In the autumn of 1942, Britain was losing ships to U-boats fast enough to make panic feel practical. Geoffrey Pike, an inventor with a taste for impossible things, sent Lord Louis Mountbatten a proposal for a floating airfield made not from steel, but from ice. A literal iceberg that almost became a warship. Project Habakkuk rested on a simple claim: ice could resist bullets, shells, and the Atlantic itself. Not ordinary ice, a frozen mix of water and wood pulp called pykrete, dense enough to sound ridiculous and convincing at the same time. Churchill pushed the plan forward in December 1942. In wartime, the distance between desperation and innovation can shrink to a stamped document. Canada was pulled in at once. It had the cold, the laboratories, and something Britain did not: time in a freezer. On January 8, 1943, C.J. Mackenzie at Canada's National Research Council received the urgent request. By January 26th, he had secured $150,000 to begin the work. The money did not buy a ship. It bought a list of problems. Could ice be shaped into a hull? Could it carry a runway? Could it stay intact in salt water long enough to matter? So the work moved to Patricia Lake near Jasper, remote enough to hide a secret and cold enough to keep it. In 1943, a 1-50 prototype rose there. Refrigeration equipment hummed inside while scientists studied insulation, wood pulp, and the behavior of frozen material under stress. The model was about 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, and nearly 20 feet high. Too large to dismiss as a toy. Too strange to call normal. Floated in the cold while men examined it as if building an ice vessel were ordinary wartime business. That was Habakkuk's first promise: ice that was hard to kill. It was not supposed to melt quickly. It was not supposed to crack under fire. It was supposed to turn the ocean into armor. The first results did not wreck that promise. They strengthened it. In February 1943, tests showed that wood pulp changed everything, making the frozen blocks dramatically tougher than plain ice. An axe barely marked it. A bullet could do little more. At the Quebec conference in August, Mountbatten used that fact like a stage trick, putting a block in front of Allied leaders that looked fragile until it refused to behave that way. That demonstration became the legend. The revolver shot, the ricochet, a strategic meeting turning for a second into slapstick terror. But the ice was never the part that broke the plan. Everything around it did. A full Habakkuk ship would have needed a runway about 600 meters long and 60 meters wide. Its ice walls would have been 9 meters thick, with a draft around 45 meters. It would have displaced about 2,200,000 tons. One vessel might require 1,700,000 tons of pykrete, plus a plant covering roughly 100 acres just to make the material. Another estimate from Canada put the bill at 300,000 tons of wood pulp, 6,000 to 8,000 men for a year, and somewhere between $50 million and $100 million. Ice was cheap. The ship was not. By August 1943, the British Chiefs of Staff still took it seriously enough to sketch a Habakkuk II some 1,700 to 2,200 feet long, moving at about 7 knots, perhaps ready by mid-1945 if the tests kept going well. The Atlantic War was already changing shape. Longer-range aircraft were arriving. Escort carriers were multiplying. Radar was tightening the noose around the U-boats. The giant Iceberg carrier stopped looking like an answer and started looking like lost time. The issue was no longer whether pykrete could survive a bullet. It could. The issue was whether the whole system around it could survive contact with reality. The answer came in pieces: refrigeration loads, steel shortages, labor counts, pulp supplies, and a war moving faster than the idea could freeze itself into usefulness. By early 1944, Habakkuk was dead on paper. What remained was stranger than the plan itself, an absurd weapon that never became a ship, yet still taught scientists how ice creeps, bends, and yields under pressure. The project never sailed. It left behind data, frozen wood pulp under strain, and a hard final verdict. The Iceberg was not defeated by fire. It was defeated by engineering. Number 6. The animal weapon. The bomb that tried to recruit an animal instinct. In January 1942, Lytle S. Adams, a dental surgeon from Irwin, Pennsylvania, walked through Carlsbad Caverns and looked up at a ceiling alive with bats. Pearl Harbor was only weeks behind him. America was improvising at speed. Adams saw something that sounded insane even by wartime standards: a fire weapon that might work better than bombers for one specific job. Not because it carried a bigger charge, because it could hide the charge inside a city. The myth is easy to laugh at. Bats with bombs strapped to them, a cartoon weapon, a panic idea. But the evidence points somewhere colder. Adams sent the proposal to the White House that same month, and it did not die in a clerk's drawer. President Franklin D. Roosevelt judged it bizarre, but worth examining. The logic was not comic, it was urban. Japanese cities still contained vast districts of wood and paper construction, dense enough that fire did not need much help once it found the right opening. So why would bats be better than aircraft at starting fires? Aircraft drop from above. Bats disappear inside. They slip under eaves, into attics, into rafters and wall spaces where firefighters reach last, if they reach them at all. Army testing later claimed the concept could produce 10 times more fires than an equivalent load of conventional incendiaries. Maybe that number was optimistic, but the claim shows what kind of weapon this was meant to be. Not a blast, not a crater. A city seeded with hundreds of tiny ignition points, each one hidden in the timber skeleton of a home. On May 2, 1943, Adams's team had reached the Army test establishment in California for airdrop trials. The delivery system was elaborate, almost theatrical. Mexican free-tailed bats would be chilled into torpor, packed into a bomb-shaped canister, and dropped by aircraft. A parachute would slow the descent. At around 1,000 feet, the casing would open. Warming in the air, the bats would wake, scatter across an area projected at 20 to 40 miles, and do what bats do without instruction: seek dark overhead shelter before daylight. Only this time, each animal would be carrying a tiny, timed incendiary. You can feel the seduction of the idea in that sequence. No guidance fins, no radio control, no pilot making a second pass through anti-aircraft fire. The city itself would become the target map, because the animals were expected to sort themselves into the exact places fire spreads best. At the top of the iceberg, a weapon helps a soldier survive the battle. Here the design is already drifting towards something broader and uglier. The planned ignition of civilian space, room by room, roof by roof. Then the evidence stopped being theoretical. During testing at Carlsbad Army Airfield, some armed bats escaped. They flew off, found places to roost, and set American facilities on fire instead of Japanese ones. A hangar burned. So did a general's car. The program's most vivid proof of concept was an accident on home soil. That single mishap punctures the myth more effectively than any memo. If this had only been a crackpot proposal, nothing would have happened. But something did happen. The charges armed. The animals behaved as expected. Fire started where the planners feared they would start. The failure was not that the bats refused to work. The failure was that they worked before anyone could point them overseas. In August 1943, the Navy took over and gave the project its official code name, Project X-ray. Even then, sources grow fuzzier on exactly how the decision chain ended. Some accounts point to slow development, others to resources being pulled toward bigger priorities, including the atomic program. The cleanest conclusion is simpler. This was not a joke weapon that never got off the ground. It got far enough to reveal what it really was. Not a bomb that carried bats. A plan to turn roosting into guidance. Number 5. The silent trans-Pacific weapon. On November 3, 1944, Japan began sending paper balloons into the winter jet stream. The idea sounded absurd. A 33-foot shell of paper and hydrogen drifted at 30,000 to 40,000 feet, riding winds from more than 6,000 miles across the Pacific. The targets were not absurd. Forests in the American Northwest, power lines, towns, anything dry enough to burn. By the time the campaign ended, about 9,000 of these Fu-Go balloons had been launched over 5 months. Perhaps 1,000 made it to North America, though only about 285 incidents were ever reported. Most fell into the ocean, most broke apart, most vanished into snow, woods, and silence. That silence mattered. Washington imposed press censorship. If Tokyo heard nothing, Japanese commanders might assume the weapon had failed. So across California, Alaska, and inland states, wreckage turned up and stories were buried. Then one balloon hit something else entirely. On March 10, 1945, a balloon struck a power line at Hanford Engineer Works, the plutonium site tied to the Manhattan Project. It cut power in a place where electricity was supposed to be far more secure than weather. The weapon was not supposed to reach that far. It did. Then came May 5, 1945, near Bly, Oregon. Reverend Archie Mitchell drove his pregnant wife Elsie and 5 Sunday school children out to Leonard Creek on Gearhart Mountain for a picnic. He parked the car. Elsie and the children wandered into the woods. An unfamiliar object lay on the ground. One of them apparently tugged it. 1 second the forest was quiet. The next, the blast ripped it open. Elsie Mitchell died. Jay Gifford died. Edward Engen died. Patsky died. Joan Patsky died. Sherman Shoemaker died. Archie was the only survivor. For the continental United States, it was the only known enemy action in World War II that killed civilians directly on American soil. The government had kept the earlier warnings bottled up. Only after the Bly deaths did U.S. authorities publicly tell Americans not to touch balloon debris. On May 22, 1945, the press blackout ended. By then, the campaign was already fading. Japan had stopped the launches in April. The bomb that crossed the Pacific by weather arrived too late to change the war, but not too late to kill. That was Fugo. Japan launched thousands of balloons in late 1944 and 1945, trusting the jet stream to do what bombers could not. The balloons used altitude control mechanisms to ride air currents over the ocean. Some came down harmlessly. Some caused fires. One touched Hanford. One killed 6 people in Oregon. A paper balloon crossed an ocean, drifted into American woods, and left 6 people dead. Number 4. The poison Germany did not use. The balloons crossed an ocean on wind alone. Another weapon in this war traveled a shorter distance and promised something far worse. Not blast, not fragments, but a vapor no soldier could see and no sensor could hide once released. In Berlin, the strangest part was not that Germany made it. It was that Germany stopped with the shells full. On May 15, 1943, Albert Speer brought Otto Ambros to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Ambros was not a general. He was an IG Farben chemist, one of the men closest to a substance first stumbled upon on December 23, 1936, when Gerhard Schroeder's pesticide research produced a nerve agent instead. Hitler wanted a plain answer. Did the enemy have anything like it? The gas that waited in shells until the war ended. The record here is not a dramatic battlefield report. It is testimony, memoir, post-war reconstruction. A regime willing to murder on an industrial scale had, by 1943, something Britain and the United States did not yet understand Germany possessed: nerve agent munitions. No order came. By then, the secret production line at Diehenfurt, near Breslau, was already turning chemistry into stockpile. From 1942 to 1945, the plant produced Tabun on an industrial scale. Not grams, not laboratory vials. About 12,000 metric tons. It was loaded into 105mm shells, 150mm shells, 250-kilogram bombs, 150mm rockets. The point was not simply to have poison. The point was to have delivery systems already familiar to an army at war. Ambros later claimed he warned Hitler that Tabun might not be a German monopoly at all. Maybe the Allies knew it. Maybe they had something similar. Maybe using it would trigger retaliation on a scale Germany could not control. That claim has to be handled carefully because much of it comes from Ambros himself after the war, when every witness had reasons to shape his own role. But the silence that followed is real. Production continued. Shells accumulated. The battlefield never received them. The Allies were still preparing for the older chemical war: mustard gas, phosgene, the agents from the previous generation. According to U.S. Army histories, they did not know Germany had stockpiled nerve agent munitions during the war. If Hitler held back because he feared equal retaliation, He was deterring himself against an enemy whose actual arsenal was different from the one he imagined. That matters because this is the point on the iceberg where the usual question starts to shift. At the top, a weapon is judged by whether it helps a soldier survive a battle. Tabun could kill through a shell, a bomb, a rocket. But its story is not about soldiers meeting it in combat. It is about a state manufacturing a battlefield agent in secret, while no one is sure whether using it would open a front that could never be closed. Germany produced about 78,000 tons of chemical warfare agents in the Second World War overall. Tabun was only part of that total, but it was the unnerving part, the one that belonged to a newer category. You can feel the mismatch. The shell is familiar, the filling is not. Artillery doctrine still works. The chemistry inside has moved ahead of the assumptions around it. Then the map changed. Early 1945, as Soviet forces reached the Oder, the stockpile stopped looking like a wonder weapon and started looking like evidence, cargo, and hazard. Some munitions were moved west, some were captured. Some simply vanished into the confusion that follows a collapsing state. Large quantities of German chemical munitions were later dumped into the Baltic, the Skagerrak, and other waters because getting rid of them fast mattered more than documenting them perfectly. One reported load alone was about 69,000 Tabun shells, sunk in 2 ships near the Little Belt in the last days of the war. In 1959 and 1960, those shells were recovered, set in concrete, and dumped again, this time in the Bay of Biscay. Officially, Germany's nerve agent had not been used in battle. In practice, it spent years moving from depot to ship to seabed, and even the final disposal trail breaks into partial records and cautious estimates. Number 3. The disease weapon that was used. The weapon that turned infection into an attack plan. On November 4, 1941, Dr. Chen Wen-Kuei arrived in Chengde, Hunan, after a pattern no physician wanted to see twice. A Japanese plane had come in low over the East Gate district and dropped a strange mix onto 2 streets: wheat, rice, paper, cotton. Not explosives, not shrapnel, just debris drifting down into a Chinese city at wartime. Within 3 weeks, 6 people were dead. Chen was not guessing. He had been a plague expert with the League of Nations. He examined the final victim, took cultures, ran animal tests, and confirmed what the city feared: plague. The oddest part was that the attack itself looked almost harmless. A few scraps falling from an aircraft, a little grain in the road. But survival in battle no longer depended only on what hit you that morning. It depended on what kept moving after the aircraft was gone. A year earlier, on October 27, 1940, the same shape had already appeared in Ningbo. At about 7 a.m., Japanese bombers flew low over the city's center, around 200 meters, close enough that people below could see the run clearly. They released grain, cotton strips, and something too small to notice in the moment. 3 days later, on October 30th, the first recorded death appeared. By November 2nd, officials recognized an epidemic and sealed off the infected area. The last 2 deaths were recorded on December 2nd. One Ningbo survey later counted 106 named victims. Another figure cited later was 99 cases and 98 deaths. The exact total remains disputed, but the shape of the event does not. A plane passes, material falls. Days later, people begin dying of plague. Delay made the weapon colder. A shell announces itself. A bomb crater can be measured before the dust settles. But an epidemic arrives wearing the face of ordinary life. Someone walks through a market. Someone brushes dust from a sleeve. A rat finds food. A flea finds blood. By the time a doctor sees the pattern, the aircraft is gone, the crew is gone, and the attack has dissolved into the city itself. For years, that left room for denial. Outbreaks happen in war. Cities are crowded. Sanitation fails. People flee. Disease follows armies all through history. So an unexplained cluster of plague after a Japanese operation could be filed as tragedy, coincidence, or chaos. But the record kept pointing in a more specific direction. Ningbo in 1940, Changde in 1941. Low-altitude overflights. Strange materials scattered, not detonated. Then plague confirmed on the ground by a man qualified to know exactly what he was looking at. In 2002, more than 60 years later, the Tokyo District Court formally recognized that Imperial Japanese Army units, including Unit 731, had used germ warfare in China. Compensation was denied, but the acknowledgement mattered because it pinned scattered outbreaks to a structure, not rumor, not just testimony floating in the post-war fog, a program. And that program was larger than a single laboratory. Historian Keiichi Tsuneshi's reconstruction describes pathogens cultivated by Unit 731 and shipped south to Unit 1644 in Nanjing, where they could be prepared for field use. The delivery system in Ningbo was built around plague-infected fleas that had fed on infected rats. The grain and cotton were not random litter. They were there to cushion the drop, keep the fleas alive, and help them find hosts after impact. The bomb was partly ecological. The city was expected to do the rest. Those outbreaks in Ningbo and Changde were not just disease appearing near war. They were the result of an organization turning one of history's oldest killers into a method. Aircraft above, fleas below, laboratories behind them. Unit 731 did not simply study plague. It arranged for plague to land in the street like weather, where people bent to inspect bits of cotton and grain and carried the real weapon home on their clothes. Number 2. The island that stayed contaminated. In 1942, on a small Scottish island battered by wind and salt spray, Britain tested a weapon meant to poison an enemy's dinner table. Grenard Island sat off the northwest coast like an afterthought, but inside the Porton Down program, it had a different name, X-Base. That name mattered. What happened there was never meant to stay local. It was a rehearsal for turning the food chain into a battlefield. Paul Filds, a bacteriologist with a grim imagination and a very practical mission, pushed a plan called Operation Vegetarian. Not bombs over cities, not shells in trenches, linseed cattle cakes. Small feed blocks laced with anthrax, designed to be dropped over German pasture so cattle would eat them, die, and carry the attack into meat, milk, and rationing. The target was hunger. In July 1942, the first trials began on Grenard. Sheep were loaded across to the island, tethered downwind, and exposed to anthrax aerosols from small bombs. Imperial War Museum's film record shows the sequence with chilling calm. The crates, the transfer, the waiting. Deaths began on the third day. More tests followed in September, and 4 more in the summer of 1943. Each round sharpened the same questions. Could anthrax survive open air? Could it spread far enough? Could it last long enough to matter? The answer was yes. That answer unlocked the other half of the plan. Britain produced about 5 million anthrax-laced cattle cakes in less than 2 years. Not a handful. 5 million. Weapons were built to be delivered from flare chutes on long-range bombers, scattered over farmland so livestock would swallow the contamination before anyone understood what had been dropped. This was sabotage measured in herds, in fields, in weeks of panic as food systems started failing from the inside. Grenard itself became the proof and the punishment. The island stayed closed after the trials because the spores stayed. For decades, the soil held onto them. A later survey found that the contamination was largely confined to the top 8 centimeters of ground, but it sat there across a 2.6-hectare patch of a 211-hectare island, waiting in the earth like a buried argument that never ended. In the 1980s, decontamination crews treated the island with 5% formaldehyde in seawater. Sheep were then allowed to graze for 5 months without contracting anthrax. Only in 1990 was Grenard publicly declared safe. By then, the island had already done its second job. It had shown what a biological weapon could leave behind when the attack was over. Not a crater, not wreckage. Contaminated land, a shut shoreline, a place that could not be trusted for grazing or memory. Operation Vegetarian was the secret plan that could have weaponized hunger, and Grenard was the island that stayed dangerous long after the war had moved on. Number 1. The bottom of the iceberg. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, a steel tower vanished in a light so bright that men watching from 10,000 yards away felt it through closed goggles. The fireball climbed, changed color, and left a column rising into the dark, industrial, and biblical at once. One device had just proved that a few pounds of matter, handled the right way, could tear open a city-sized future in less than a minute. It was a weapon that made victory look like a warning. The strangest part came next. The first bomb used in war was not the one tested there. Little Boy, the uranium weapon, was considered likely enough to work that no full-scale combat test was done first. So on August 5, 1945, on Tinian Island, Navy Captain William Deke Parsons prepared to arm an atomic bomb after takeoff inside the aircraft. An overloaded B-29 crashing on the runway with a live nuclear weapon aboard was too dangerous to risk. The plane was a stripped-down silver plate B-29. It was about 7,200 pounds lighter after armor and gun turrets were removed, so it could carry a bomb weighing roughly 9,700 pounds and stretching 10 feet long. At 2:45 a.m. Tinian time on August 6th, the Enola Gay lifted into the dark with Little Boy in its bay. Parsons armed it in flight. Morris Jepson later replaced the safety plugs. Inside that aircraft, the scene shrinks to metal, vibration, and procedure. A cramped fuselage, engine noise pressing through the frame, checklists in hand. Men leaning over a mechanism built around about 140 pounds of highly enriched uranium. Only about 1.38% of that uranium would actually fission. It would still be enough. At 8:16:02 a.m. Hiroshima time, after a fall of 43 seconds, Little Boy detonated above the city. The numbers turned cold very quickly. 10 feet long, 28 inches wide, 43 seconds. Under that burst was Hiroshima. Offices opening, trams moving, children walking, breakfast fires still recent in the morning air. The bomb did not fall on a fleet at sea or an army crossing a river. It arrived over a city. It killed through blast and heat, through burns and collapse, through radiation sickness and injuries that kept unfolding after the flash was gone. The Manhattan Project had taken shape across Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. It was a secret industrial world of reactors, enrichment plants, chemists, machinists, military police, and compartmentalized labor. Thousands of people built pieces of the machine without seeing the whole of it. When the whole finally appeared, secrecy ended in the public sky. 3 days later, on August 9th, another B-29 boxcar left Tinian carrying Fat Man, a different kind of bomb entirely. This was a plutonium implosion weapon, about 10,800 pounds, 10 feet 8 inches long, and 60 inches in diameter, with about 13.6 pounds of plutonium-239 at its core, surrounded by roughly 5,300 pounds of high explosives. It had needed Trinity because implosion was too complex to trust without a test. Its primary target was Kokura. Smoke and haze obscured the aiming point. One city was spared by weather and timing, and another inherited the mission. Low on fuel, pilot Charles Sweeney turned toward the secondary target. At 11:02 a.m. local time, Fat Man exploded about 1,650 feet above Nagasaki's Urakami Valley. Phrase Kokura's luck survived because tens of thousands in Nagasaki did not. Here, the old language of weapons begins to fail. A rifle can be judged by whether it jams, a tank by whether it breaks through. Even poison and disease still fit the grammar of attack, target, aftermath. This did not stay in the aftermath. It entered hospitals, marrow, pregnancies, policy rooms, school drills, missile silos, submarine patrols, and the mathematics of whether civilization can survive its own deterrence. Historians still argue whether the second bomb was necessary. They still argue whether more time after Hiroshima, a demonstration, Soviet entry into the war, or other pressure might have forced surrender without Nagasaki. The debate remains open because the bomb did not simply destroy a target. It changed the terms of every decision around it. At the top of the iceberg Weapons were judged by whether they helped a soldier survive a battle. At the bottom, that question breaks apart. Little Boy and Fat Man were not merely the deepest secret weapons of the war. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, victory could no longer be separated from the possibility of annihilation. What remains is a quiet image, a morning sky, and under it, a world that now knew how to do this.